Hello and welcome. I am Scrapperlock, and this is Let's Rant with Scrapperlock, playing City of Heroes on the Rebirth server. We are with Psyop, who's our level 9 mutation stalker. And you probably haven't seen her since she just turned level 8. I recorded a almost hour-long rant about something that I'm going to discuss again now. I'm going to kind of redo it. There are two reasons why I'm not posting the original one. I was doing the Frostfire mission for most of it, and for at least 20 minutes, I could not find one of the keys because I had missed a little corner of a room on a level like 2 levels down in the building, and I just kept searching empty levels, not finding anything while I was ranting along, and it was because I was talking and not paying attention to what I had missed, and I can't imagine that would be fun to watch. Um, Additionally, because I was half concentrating on trying to find the thing, my rant was incredibly circuitous and rambly and confusing, and I really don't think it would be enjoyable for anyone to listen to. So we're going to try again, and I'm going to be much more condensed. And I'm going to talk about this on a more philosophical level rather than a personal level. So you'll see what I mean when we get to that part. So instead of seeing the end of the Frostfire story arc, you're going to see the Superiority Ring. Hopefully, no one minds. We're level 9, heading to level 10. We've got our flight power. I realized I wasn't monitoring any of my defenses, so I put that on finally. And we don't really have many enhancements. I haven't found much. We've enhanced up Assassin's Blade a little bit last episode. I also put another slot on Reconstruction. We're going to 6-slot this one with 3 recharge and 3 health. Anyway, one of the difficulties we do have with this character is she is not in the supergroup. Apparently there is some sort of an issue. If you remember, if you go back and watch, like, I think it was Quintessence last, there was a bunch of crashing going on, and they weren't sure what it was, and they thought it had to do with like changing costumes. And I don't know if this is the same crash or a different one, but they were getting crashes that they somehow tracked to the alt invite command, and so that command has been disabled. I tried it all these different, like, didn't I do it right? Right, alt invite, etc. And I kept getting error messages. Like, what the heck is wrong with this thing? Why am I getting these error messages? And finally, I Googled it or looked it up, and yeah, it turns out that they have disabled it on this server because they think it was causing some bugs. So we will just have to do without being on a supergroup, which is frustrating because it means we can't go to the base to use it for teleporting and all the other stuff that I set it up to do with Iron Phoenix. So that's kind of annoying, but nothing I could do about that. It also means that we're going to have to like buy all of our enhancements as we get into like the 20s and 30s, because I have stored there a bunch of unused or formerly used and unslotted training SOs, the IOs, the invention and generic invention enhancements, and yeah, I can't get them out of the enhancement table because we can't go into the base. I could set a password for the base, and we could actually probably go into the base, but we can't take anything out of it. So, and we can't base teleport to it, I don't think. So, unfortunately, we're just kind of stuck until they fix it. Supposedly, they've got a fix in the works, but they're still testing it on the test center. So, hopefully, it'll be fixed by the time we're in the 20s and we actually need the invention trainers. All right, so that's enough about City of Heroes. So let's talk about our Let's Rant for today. So today, what I want to do is I was reading this thing on this one forum, and I'd only read the original post or two, and after that, somebody else made a post that made me think about it in a different way. So the subject of the rant is, what's your favorite role-playing game to play, and what's your favorite role-playing game to game master, and are they the same? And so I devised this big, long, complicated, of course, because it's me, right? I devised a big, long, complicated method of scoring them as a GM and as a player in 4 different categories across multiple games, and I ranked them, and this one won for this, and that one won for that. And that's what this whole 50-minute rant was about. But I actually now don't think that that's the right angle, that that's the right sort of direction to go. Because I think the more interesting question is, do you have the same favorite game both as a game master and as a player? And if so, why? And if not, why not? And so I guess the question is, what makes something a great game to GM? And what makes something a great game to play? And what the reason I think this has become more interesting to me now is that one of the people who posted, and I won't mention the forum because it's not a forum with a great rep, and so I don't want to really mention that. I don't want the channel to become political about this particular forum and the guy who runs it, because that's irrelevant. This was a really interesting topic. And so the question is, what makes something fun to GM and what makes something fun to play? And one of the people who responded said that, interestingly enough, the very things that make him like a game as a player make him not like it as a GM, and vice versa. And I thought that was a really interesting comment, and that if true, this actually demonstrates a real difficulty with role-playing games. His premise, his argument, is that the things that make a game fun for players to play make it hard to run. And the things that make a game easy or fun to run may make it not that great to play. And I think that that's a really interesting premise. And in our rant today, that's what I want to examine. So before we talk about what makes a game good for the players versus the GM, why don't you think about what's your favorite, if you have one, what's your favorite role-playing game to play, and what's your favorite role-playing game to run as a GM, right? What's your favorite game to be the game master for, and what's your favorite game to be a player in? Which role-playing game? And are they the same, or are they different? This one guy kind of implied that for many of us, they'd be different. We take our hide off here so these guys run away. Go away, guys. Get out of here. It's not tactically smart, but it makes these guys go away. And the reason I want them to go away is because they get in your way when you're running around. So we just won't use hide until these guys have left. So back to the question. So what makes it enjoyable, fulfilling, whatever you want to call it, to run, and what makes it enjoyable to play? And so why don't you think about it? What's your favorite game? Is it the same for both? Pause the video if you need to, and when you've got it in mind and you've decided, come on back and hear what I have to say. So I assume you're back and you've now got in your head whether you like the same game, what your favorite game is for playing, what your favorite game is for GMing. When I was doing my overly ridiculous and not worth listening to analysis where I was assigning points to different things and so forth, before I started, my knee-jerk reaction to favorite role-playing game in any aspect is always Champions. I love it. It's my favorite game. I often said best role-playing game ever made. But when I actually scored them out, what I found was that Champions didn't win all the categories for GMing, and in fact ended up tying, believe it or not, Basic and Expert and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, i.e. First Edition Dungeons and Dragons. It did not surprise me that 5th Edition Dungeons and Dragons didn't win anything. But Champions, and by this I mainly mean 2nd and 4th Edition Champions, and really when I think Champions, I really think 2nd Edition, which is how I started, was always up there as a favorite game. But it didn't outright win the GMing category. It did win the playing category, right? It's my favorite game to play. But although I enjoy GMing it, it's not my favorite game to GM. And this really shouldn't have surprised me, because when the time came for me to GM the current D&D game that I was game mastering, when I was invited to play in a D&D game by somebody else who then, anybody who's listened to this channel knows, stopped, was unable to actually run the game, and so I said, all right, well, I'll do it. And I said, all right, I'll do it. But as I was considering offering to run a game, my first thought was, what game should I run? Should I go with 5th edition D&D, which I've never played before and would be hard to run since I've never played it, or should I go with a game I've played and run before? And I thought about Champions, and I thought, as much as I love that game, I had no real interest in running it. And I didn't really think about why that is, because I do like to run the game at the table. But running the game at the table isn't all there is in game mastering. And as one person pointed out on this forum, to enjoy a game for game mastering, it has to be like all of the outside the table parts, the prep, right, have to be enjoyable, because you spend more hours as a GM prepping a game than you spend running it, right? So the game has to be fun to prep as well as run if you're a game master. Whereas a player, you're not prepping, right? You're creating a character before the game runs, and lots of people like creating characters. I like doing that. That's why I have all these alts. But creating a character takes, an afternoon or something, and then unless the character dies or you change characters for some reason in the campaign, you don't do it again for a while, right? It's not like the Game Master where every week the Game Master is prepping a new game and then running it, right? And so what I realized is Champions is hard to prep because you have to make up individual villains, right? You don't have things like groups of orcs that you can just have 5 orcs attack. But with Champions, although you could have 5 agents attack, that's not really that interesting, and usually the agents are going to be accompanied by a couple of bosses, basically villains that have to be, kind of custom made, right? And you almost have to customize every enemy in every scenario, and that takes a lot of time. And I remember counting at one point, I think I had made up, and I find this hard to believe, but I'm pretty sure it was true, over 900 villains during my time running Champions. Now, not just in the 2-year campaign that I made. I don't think I did 900 in 2 years. But over the, those 2 years plus the 4 years of high school and a year of junior high, right, I made almost 1,000 villains. And that's a lot. And just how original can the 900th or 700th one be? And similarly, the creating of the scenario is very different in something like D&D versus Champions. It's very labor intensive to make up a Champions adventure, much more so than a D&D adventure. And I don't really want to get into the details. Those of you who've done both games probably can intuit why that is. And if you haven't played both, I don't want to spend a long time, which is what I did in the video I'm not showing, explaining why. But I just feel like it was a lot more labor intensive to create a Champions adventure, and a lot more sort of tedious to do. And one of the things that you don't have that you do have in something like Dungeons and Dragons is a great set of random number generators to help you randomly create encounters and enemies and dungeons and things like that. They don't have that in Champions, and so it takes a lot more creative energy to prepare it. So although I feel like it's a lot more fun to run Champions at the table once you have something prepped, I also feel like the actual prep work is extremely labor intensive and not necessarily a lot of fun, to be honest. I mean, it was a huge amount of fun creating my first, 100 villains. But after I'd done that, the rest of them weren't all that much fun. They were just variations on a theme, right? I had like a formula that I used. Okay, it's an energy projector. I build them all the same way. The difference is just the special effect, right? Because when you're kind of almost industrially churning out villains like that, you sort of have to. So as a game master, right, what matters to me is how doable it is to make the adventure, and then how easy it is to run at the table. And so the things that make a game easy to prep and easy to run are actually things that maybe uh, don't appeal to players, because the more variables you have to deal with as a GM, the harder it is to generate stuff, right? And the fewer variables you have to deal with, the easier it is. And so what this guy was saying is what players like are options and variety, right? And lots of cool sort of tricks for their character and stuff like that. But that type of game, that type of setup makes it hard to run, right? There are more variables you need to consider when building an adventure and when you're running the session, and that makes it harder to run. And so what he argued was the games that are really easy to run, like old school D&D, aren't as much fun for the players because players don't get as many options and choices, and they get sort of straitjacketed a little bit, and so they don't enjoy it as much. And he actually named an old school game that I won't bother to name. It doesn't matter. That he was like, oh, he read this and he said this would be so easy to run. I want to run this. And when he showed it to his players, they were like, it's kind of boring. So he said, all right, we moved on to a game that's a lot harder for me to run, but is interesting to them, right? And so what he argued, and I think this is an interesting point, is that there's sort of this tension between game masters and players that's there because the things that players like to do are often hard to run, and the things that are easy to run aren't necessarily the things that players enjoy doing. And so you either have to be a very hardworking, very good GM, right, to make the players happy and still be able to keep yourself capable of doing it, sane, as it were. Or you have to like ask the players to make some compromises with their interest, because you're doing this sort of in the name of playability. And this sort of brought up to my mind, there was actually a forum post some time ago on, I think it was D&D Beyond, and there was a young woman who was DMing D&D for the first time, right? She had never played any role-playing games before, and she had volunteered in her group. Like, her group was all sort of, I don't know if they were all new. Maybe they weren't. But she was DMing for the first time. She had very little experience. And what she had asked them to do was to accept playing Player's Handbook only, right? No expansions, no Xanathar's Guide, no Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, no Tasha's Cauldron, anything, everything, none of that stuff. Just the stuff in the Player's Handbook, please. Because she said, I'm a new GM, and I just want to have fewer variables. And she wanted to do no feats, I think, and no multi-classing. And when she told her players that, there was an uproar. They told her she wasn't a good DM, that she was straitjacketing them, that she wasn't making the game fun for them, right? Because fun was having feats and multi-classing and having all the Tasha's options and the Xanathar's options. And so she came onto the forum and she said, like, am I a bad DM for still wanting to have this more restrictive set of rules? And of course, I said to her, no, you're not. You should go ahead and restrict the rules and, say to them, look, I'm asking you as a favor to me as a DM to help me learn how to run the game by not having me have to arbitrate all of these spells and options and things that are so complicated, and I don't even know really what I'm doing here yet, right? And I do think it was rather heartless on the part of her players to be like, no, we want to do the more complicated stuff, right? I mean, like, my response to that would have been, okay, then one of you DM, right? If you don't want to DM, then you go with what's comfortable for the game master. And to take a new game master and say, no, you have to do the more complicated stuff or you're a bad GM, that's just ridiculous. And it's not it's not very generous of the players, but it demonstrates the tension that this one person was talking about, right? That to make it DMable, she was asking them to stick to one book only, just the player's handbook, just the core rules. But doing that made it less fun for the players because the players like having all of these other options and they have character ideas that maybe don't fit. Like the Swashbuckler, which I like a lot, is actually a Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide or Xanathar's Guide. It's in both of those supplements. It's not in the basic player's handbook. So I've got an idea for a Swashbuckler character, like an ex pirate. If my best friend said player's handbook only, well, I wouldn't be able to do that idea. Now, I would still say, okay, that's fine. I have lots of other ideas that are player's handbook compatible. I can make up a different rogue. It's no problem, right? It's just that when I was looking at rogues, that's the idea that spoke to me. And, you know, some players, when the idea speaks to them, they really want to play it. And so you have this sort of inherent tension, I think, between like easy enough to run and prep, right, and fun for the players. So the game needs to have enough variety and enough uniqueness of player characters that the players enjoy playing it, but it needs to be simplified enough that the game master can actually run it, right? So if you think back to like the games that I said that I like, right? Playing, I love Champions, right? Champions gives me all the options I want. You can make anything up that you want in Champions, including a medieval knight, which I've done as a superhero. I actually had a guy who was supposedly like a paladin, like an actual sort of real world paladin from England, like sort of a high level D&D character type. His name was Knight Ranger, and I didn't play him for very long, but I was able to easily translate all of the paladin abilities from AD&D into Champions. It was no problem, right? You wouldn't be able to translate a superhero like this into D&D very easily, at least not AD&D, right? So I love Champions for its flexibility and character creation, and those are awesome. We're going to turn off hide because these guys are going to see me no matter what. There we go. So you have Champions, you know, it's my favorite to play, but if you think about why isn't it just flat out my favorite to GM? Why did I like say it was sort of a tie between old school like AD&D and basic expert set and Champions? It's because the individuality of the characters, particularly from the side of making villains and making bad guys, and the customizability of the characters, and also the customizability of the player characters where they can have Hunteds and dependent NPCs, and you've got to roll those up, guys, at the beginning of every time you're making up a scenario in Champions. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. I hit the wrong thing. When you're making up a scenario in Champions, if rules is written, you're supposed to roll up every single hunted and DNPC on every character sheet of every character that's participating. That includes not only the player characters, but the villains. So if you put 2 Hunteds on every villain sheet, hunted by the FBI, hunted by the CIA on one villain, the other villain hunted by Primus, hunted by the police, right? If you've got that on your character sheets for the villains, you're technically supposed to roll those up and see if the villains hunted show up, and they're supposed to show up in a way that means something, right? In the battle or whatever, you know, the FBI goes to the player characters and says, "Hey guys, you know, we want you to go after these villains." Right? And now that Hunted has made an appearance. And so, well, if you've got 4 villains with 2 Hunteds each and 4 heroes with 2 Hunteds each, right? That's 16 Hunteds. And that's not even counting the dependent NPCs. There might be 3 or 4 of those that roll up. So now you've got like, I don't know, they're not all going to roll presents, but you've got like probably 6 or 8 Hunteds and 2 or 3 dependent NPCs. That's going to be in addition to whatever the scenario is that you wanted to run. That is god awful. As much as I love champions, trying to run that, trying to prep that, is not enjoyable. And I had to fudge the hunted rolls. I basically ignored all of the villain hunted rolls, right? I broke the rules every time because it was going to make the scenario unmanageable, right? So as great as that is for players, because they can customize who's after their character and their DNPCs, and they can use it to gain points, right, for their characters, so that their characters are worth more character points, because Hunteds are worth points, right? So as great as that is for the players, right, it's a nightmare for the GM, because you have to make all of these hunted rolls and try to figure out how to fit all this crap into a single story. And it's not easy to do, guys. It's just not. And so, there's Maxwell. I don't know if we're going to be able to beat. Oh, we got a luck. That's awesome. So I think that's one of the reasons why Champions isn't necessarily just flat out my favorite game to GM, because it does include having to deal with the Hunteds and the DNPCs when you're prepping. And the other thing is the constant tug of war between game masters and players. I keep forgetting that this character doesn't have Mez defense and getting smacked around by the Mez. There's this constant tension between players and game masters because of the fact that the rules in Champions really don't prohibit anything, and they allow players to buy anything, and then the GM has to fight with you about whether you can use extra dimensional movement or not, and what the restrictions are on extra dimensional movement, or like with me, always trying to wrestle with the players about whether they should be able to take variable power pool, which they always wanted, so they can have any power in the game, or variable special effect, or variable advantage. Guys, I have like a 4 or 5 page single spaced, here are my house rules thing for my 2-year campaign, that was basically going through the whole rule book and saying this is allowed, this isn't, this is allowed, this isn't, right? And that's a tension between the players and the GM that is caused by the flexibility of the system, where the GM has to lower the boom sometimes because the system is just so flexible that you can do anything, and sometimes the anything is just going to break the game, right? And so that's why, as much as I love hang on, do we get Mez defense? This is Mez defense. Okay, so mind over body is a toggle. High pain tolerance is passive. We'll still take the passive. This way we don't have to spend endurance. So there's this tension where you have this great customizability in the game, right? But the expense of it is that the GM now has to do all of the kind of all of the regulating that isn't done in the rules because of the customizability, right? And so I think that this person who talked about this on the forum that I was reading actually has a really good, actually no, I want to put this on here, actually has a really good point, that a game that is great for the player sometimes isn't so great for the game master. So I think this is actually a good place to stop. Let me know in the comments, guys, what you think. Do you like the same game? Is the same game your favorite for both player and GM? If so, great. If not, is it for the reason that this guy and I are asserting? Is it that the things that are fun for the players, right, being wildly overpowered, doing all kinds of crazy stuff. I mean, there's this tension between, like, even in my 5th edition game, between my best friend and I, because he wants all these highly powerful options because he thinks it will quote unquote be fun, right? And it will be for him, but I'm looking at this going, how am I going to run a battle if he can do this stuff? How am I going to make it challenging to the players if he can do this? One of the things he asked me to do, so we're not actually stopping it, but I think this is a good example. One of the things he asked me to do, he saw it on some game, I don't know where, allowing concentrating on 2 spells at the same time. In D&D, the 5th edition, the rule is you can only have 1 concentration spell up at a time. If you throw out a 2nd concentration spell, the first one ends. No, can we concentrate on 2 spells at once? And this other GM does it, and there's like this custom feat, and he posted the text of the custom feat. And I'm like, oh man, this sounds wildly overpowered. And I watched a video by these guys called the Dungeon Dudes, and they actually addressed this, and they said, no, you shouldn't allow it because it's going to make it that much harder to challenge the players because they can be even more powerful than they already are. And lots of GMs will say, even without that rule, 5th edition characters, after they get over 10th, 11th level, they become gods practically with what they can do. They can stop time and they can teleport all over the world and they can wish and all this stuff. And how do you run a game like that? Players love that stuff. And Gary Gygax in the Dungeon Master's Guide, actually at the beginning, I have it right here. I'm going to see if I can find it. Kind of alludes to this as well. That he says participants, the players, will always be pushing for a game which allows them to become strong and powerful far too quickly. Each will attempt to take the game out of your hands and mold it to his own ends, meaning trying to be powerful, trying to be godlike. That's what's fun for the players. But Gygax goes on to say, if you allow this, it's going to break your game. And so he created the AD&D rules to kind of try and prevent that as much as he could and help the GM. And a lot of players don't like AD&D because, quote unquote, it's not fun enough, meaning we don't get powerful enough, we don't have enough options, it's not flexible enough for us, right? And what Gygax is saying here is the game's going to become unmanageable if you let the players have everything they want. On the other hand, if you don't let the players have at least enough of what they want, they're not going to have any fun, which is why this one GM said, although he looked at this old school, this OSR game, and said this would be super fun and easy to run for me, right? They put out all these supplements. I could use them as written. I wouldn't have to make up dungeons. The game, like the combat's really streamlined. It's super easy. When his players looked at it, they're like, yeah, this is boring. We don't want to play this, right? So I think there really is this inherent tension between the things that are fun for players make the GM's life harder, and the things that are easier and maybe more fun for the GM aren't necessarily all that awesome for players. And so you have to figure out, you have to find, like, walk that tightrope of the happy medium of simple enough, easy enough, doable enough that the game master can actually run it and enjoy running it, but free enough and flexible enough that the players will enjoy the game, right? And enjoy the creativity that the game allows. It has to allow enough creativity for them to enjoy it, but not be so wildly open-ended, free-for-all, that the GM has no control and everything is going crazy and they can't run it. Or, like Champions, it's not that hard to run, right? But the prep time, making up the villains, and also the pre-game time of the constant discussion with players as they gain experience of what powers they're allowed to buy, when they're allowed to go up in dice, right? First 10 experience, you could go up from a 60 to a 70 d6, 70 point, from a 12 to a 14 d6 attack. And as a GM, I'm like, nope, nobody can go up yet. But I want to go up. Why can't I have a more powerful energy blast? No, everybody's got to stay at 12 dice 6 first. You go up when I say, right? And so there's this constant tension because the players want to do more, right? And the GM knows if you do too much, I'm not going to be able to challenge you. And so I think there is this constant tension between what's fun for the players and what's manageable for the GM. And that's why I think a lot of times there are players who want to play one game and the GM wants to run another. And I think the players want to play the game that lets them do the 5th edition or the Champions thing where they can be as powerful as they want and make up whatever they want and be godlike and superheroes, right? But the GM is like, that's hard to run, and I'd rather run this like old school basic expert, right? I mean, lots of people, GMs who talk about D&D, don't run AD&D. Run basic set, an expert set. Well, AD&D gives you a lot more options. As restrictive as it is, AD&D gives you a lot more options than the basic and expert set, right? And so, if that's true, then the players might like AD&D better because you can be a lot more classes and subclasses, and there's more complicated alignment rules, right? Basic is just law, chaos, that's it, and neutrality, right? And your classes are fighter, cleric, magic user, thief, elf, dwarf, halfling. There are no like quote unquote races. The 4 named classes are human, and then elf is a class, halfling is a class and race, right? And dwarf is a class. So basically, all dwarves are dwarven fighters, and all halflings are halfling thieves, and all elves are elven fighter magic users, essentially, in basic and expert. And you don't get any choices about that. And things are much simpler. And what they'll tell you is, hey, it's so much easier to run, right? And it is. But players go, but I want my elf to be an elven cleric. That's my cool idea, that it worships an elven Coralal Nerethian or whatever, the elven god, and, like, he was abandoned at a temple and raised to be a cleric, and like, no, elves can't do that. You got to be a human cleric, right? So then that restricts the players, and they get frustrated. And so you want to find a compromise between what's easy enough to run and what's fun for the players. This is why we need to talk to our players and have a conversation about what system is best. One thing I would say is, guys, don't always just assume the system, right? Don't say, well, we're a 5e group. Like with my group, we're a 5e group. We've been playing 5e all along. We're just going to keep playing 5e. If that's unmanageable for you as a DM, and there might be other games that your players would like Lion and Dragon or Lamentations of the Flame Princess or something, try it out with them and see if they like it, right? For instance, with my group, I'm not running D&D anymore, ever, because I find it really hard and unenjoyable to run, and very frustrating to run. And so if it turned out that, my best friend who's supposed to be the next long-term GM couldn't do it, and they turned to me and said, can you run something, Scrapper? I'd say, sure. Literally, I could start the week after we finish my Rome game. I would be ready to run again. But it won't be D&D. Are you guys willing to try Savage Worlds or Call of Cthulhu or something else? And this is where, like Call of Cthulhu, you're a human and you're mortal and you only have like a pistol maybe or a knife and some skills, and you're not a superhero and you can't do superheroic things, and when monsters show up you got to run because they'll kill you. And I think my best friend would be like, that's not any fun. Easy to run. I've heard that Call of Cthulhu is like one of the easiest games to run, because everything is just skill-based and percentile-based. So you know what chance somebody has to do something just with percent, right? Super easy. It's easy to run. Super fun to prepare. They've got tons of scenarios to choose from, so you don't even have to write your own. But if the players aren't going to have any fun, there's no point to playing it, right? So, but what I am saying is, don't assume the game. I will say to my friends, look, I'll run something, but it won't be 5e. So is there a game we can all find that provides you with enough enjoyment, flexibility, etc., but me enough fun to run as a GM? And maybe that's Savage Worlds, maybe that would be Champions, maybe that would be the Star Trek Adventures game, right? I don't know. But there might be some happy medium. And that's what I would say. You need to find the happy medium between what's fun to GM and what's fun to play. Unless you're really lucky and you like to both play and GM the same game, or more accurately, you really love to GM the game that your players really love to play. Anyway, leave comments below on what you think about this. Hopefully this was a better rant than the one I actually filmed before and deleted. And we're level 10 now, so hopefully that'll make things a little bit easier. We still don't have Mez Defense, but we should be getting that at level like 12 or 16. Until next time, I am Scrapperlock, and this has been Let's Rant with Scrapperlock on the City of Heroes Rebirth server.